The wind that came down off the Appalachian ridgeline in late autumn had no patience for anything soft. The old-timers in Ridgeton called it the widow's breath, and they did not mean it tenderly. They meant it the way a man means something when he warns his son about it, the way a woman means something when she pulls her children inside before it arrives. It came from the north without announcement, without the courtesy of building slowly, and it did not distinguish between the living and the dead, between the grieving and the content, between the woman who had a fire and the woman who did not. It simply arrived and stripped everything down to what it actually was. Anselma Blackwell had grown up learning to read that wind the way other children learn to read primer books. Her father had taught her before she was 10 that the widow's breath changed pitch in the pine canopy before it changed direction on the ground, and that if you watched the tallest trees on the northeast ridge, you had maybe 20 minutes to finish what you were doing outside before the temperature dropped 10 degrees and the cold became something personal. She had spent 29 years acquiring knowledge like this, the specific, unglamorous kind that accrued to people who lived on mountains instead of near them, who woke before sunrise not because they were virtuous, but because the work required it. She knew which creek bends froze first and which stayed open through February. She knew that the deer moved down off the high ridges 3 days before any storm arrived, and that this was a more reliable forecast than anything the almanac printed. She knew the smell of snow before it fell, a clean metallic sharpness and that sat in the back of the throat like a swallowed coin. What she did not know, standing outside the Ridgeton County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in October of 1893, was what to do with the knowledge that her husband had been keeping a second set of books on their life together. The courthouse steps were cold limestone, and the wind moved through the gap between the building and the livery stable across the street with a sound like something being slowly torn apart. Josias Dillingham had read the documents twice, once in the voice he used for official proceedings, once more quietly, as if a second reading might produce a different result. It did not. Galen Blackwell, deceased as of August 14th, had borrowed $460 from Cornelius Kinnaird at a rate and under terms that gave Kinnaird the legal right to claim any collateral property if the debt remained unpaid 6 months after the borrower's death. The loan had been executed in March of that year, 5 months before the accident at the Harmon Creek mine shaft, and it had been secured against the full value of the household assets, which meant everything Anselma had believed she owned in common with her husband had in fact been quietly pledged against a debt she had never been told about. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment after Dillingham finished. The wind came through the gap and hit her in the face, and she let it. Galen had not been a dishonest man. She understood this the way she understood things that were painful and true simultaneously. He had been a man who believed the problem would be solved before it became a problem. A man who lived in the 2-week future where everything had worked out, who signed papers in March, confident that by September the investment in the Harmon Creek operation would have returned what he'd borrowed, and Kinnaird would have been paid, and no one would ever need to know the precise shape of the risk he'd taken. He had not been dishonest. He had been wrong. And in the end, these produced the same result. She had 4 months. Dillingham was speaking again, something measured and professional, about options, about negotiating, timelines, about the possibility of partial settlement. She heard his voice without processing the words, the way you hear rain on a roof when you are thinking about something else. 4 months from October was February. February on the Appalachian ridgeline was not a month that extended grace to people trying to solve complicated problems. February was a month that reduced everything to its simplest components: heat, food, shelter. Whether or not Kinnaird could be negotiated with was a February problem. October was for surviving long enough to reach February. She thanked Dillingham with the economy of words she used for everything and walked back through Ridgeton toward the road that climbed northeast out of town. Lavinia Ashworth's general store occupied the corner of Main and Sycamore in a building that had been a livery originally and still smelled faintly of horses in the back room. Lavinia Ashworth herself was behind the counter when Anselma came through the door. A solid-framed woman in her mid-40s with gray beginning at both temples and the efficient movements of someone who had been running a store since before efficiency was a concept she'd had to name. She looked up from the ledger she was working, and her expression did the careful thing that everyone in Ridgeton's expression did when they looked at Anselma these days. A slight adjustment, a managed neutrality that was trying very hard not to be pity, but was built out of the same material. There was a small stack of items on the counter that Anselma had not put there. A sack of dried beans, a half round of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a box of matches. Lavinia slid them forward without ceremony. Galen left a few things on account. They're yours. Anselma looked at the items. Galen had been dead for 2 months and she was still finding the edges of him, the small shapes of his habits and intentions that she kept encountering in unexpected places. A debt she hadn't known about, beans she hadn't ordered, the outline of a man drawn not by his presence, but by the impressions he'd left behind in other people's ledgers and lives. She accepted the items and set her own list on the counter. What Lavinia's face did when she read the list was not quite what Anselma had expected. There was no dramatic response, no challenge or confrontation. There was instead a very brief pause, the kind that happens when a person's understanding of a situation updates itself faster than their expression can follow. A canvas tent rated for mountain conditions, a full-weight pickaxe, a long-handled coal shovel, a mason's hammer, a set of stone chisels graduated, 50 pounds of dried beans, 20 pounds of flour, salt, matches, candles enough to last months. Lavinia filled the order without commentary, which was its own form of commentary. The deliberate withholding of the observation that this was not a list of items a woman bought when she was preparing to leave. The bell above the door rang, and Reverend Matthias Oglesby stepped into the store with the particular posture of a man who entered rooms expecting them to arrange themselves around his authority. He was late 50s, lean-faced with eyes that moved quickly and a voice calibrated to sound concerned even when the concern had not been requested. He had been the spiritual steward of Ridgeton for 9 years, and he had developed the habit of treating other people's difficulties as invitations for his guidance. It was not malice. It was something more difficult to argue with. He genuinely believed he was helping. He looked at the pile of supplies on the counter. He looked at Anselma. He looked at Lavinia, who had stopped moving and was watching the scene with the neutral attention of a woman who ran a store and therefore witnessed a great deal without participating in it. Anselma, his voice had the soft, measured quality he used for hospital visits and funerals. I heard about the proceedings at the courthouse this morning. I want you to know that the congregation is thinking of you. He paused, and the pause was doing work, creating space for the thing he actually wanted to say. You shouldn't be making large decisions while you're grieving. Let me speak with Kinnaird. He's a reasonable man. Perhaps we can find a solution that doesn't require you to do anything extreme. He gestured at the supplies with an open hand that managed to make the gesture look like benediction rather than judgment. Anselma looked at him. She did not dislike Matthias Oglesby. She understood that he operated from a model of the world in which people who were struggling needed someone to think for them, and that this model had served him adequately in situations where the struggling person was in fact unable to think. She was not that person. I appreciate your concern, Reverend, but I'm not grieving. I'm buying supplies. She said it without heat, without defiance, without any of the emotional content that would have given him something to counsel against. She said it as a statement of fact, the way she might have said the temperature was dropping or the creek was rising. Oglesby stood for a moment with his concern assembled and nowhere to direct it. Then he nodded a small, tight nod that preserved his dignity while conceding the point and left the store. Lavinia watched the door close behind him and then reached under the counter and placed one additional item on top of the pile. A slim book with a dark brown cover gone soft at the corners, the spine reading Practical Frontier Construction, 1887 in faded gilt letters. Galen brought this in back in the spring, said he'd come back for it. Lavinia's hand rested on it a moment. He didn't make it back. Anselma picked it up. The pages were slightly warped from humidity, the kind of warping that happened to books that had been read in damp conditions or left near a window. She opened it at random, and the pages fell naturally to a chapter near the middle, as if that section had been visited more often than the rest. The chapter heading read in the plain declarative style of practical literature from that era: Earth-Sheltered Structures of the American Frontier, Principles in Construction. Below it, in smaller text, a single sentence that someone had underlined in soft pencil: "The earth does not fight the cold, it outlasts it. A structure built within the earth rather than upon it borrows this patience." The underlining was in Galen's hand. She recognized the pressure of it, the slight leftward lean he gave his pencil marks. He had been here in this text, had read this sentence and drawn a line under it and moved on to the next page. And she was holding what he had left behind, which was not money and not an explanation and not an apology, but a line drawn under a sentence about patience in a book he never came back for. She paid for everything except the book, which Lavinia waved off, and she was loading the pack she'd carried into town when she met Nola Brashear on the boardwalk outside. Nola was 24, a widow herself since the previous winter when her husband Cassius had died of the fever that swept through the lower valley and took 3 men and 1 child before it burned itself out. She was small and quiet and had a quality about her that Anselma recognized because it lived in her own mirror. The quality of a woman who had been recalibrated by loss and was still determining what the new settings meant. Nola had been the only person in Ridgeton who came to Anselma after Galen's funeral without bringing advice. She brought a pot of soup and sat in Anselma's kitchen for an afternoon, without saying a word, because she understood that silence was sometimes the only useful thing one person could offer another. "Where are you going with all that?" Nola asked, looking at the pack. "Up the mountain." Nola studied her face for a moment, and whatever she found there she did not argue with. But something crossed her expression, a shadow that was not about Anselma's plan. "Kinnaird came to my house last week," she said, lowering her voice, though no one was near enough to hear. "Asked about you, asked if I knew what you were planning to do." Anselma absorbed this. Kinnaird had been asking about her before she had done anything to ask about. Before the courthouse reading, before the supply list, before any of it. A man collecting a debt waited for the deadline and then acted. A man asking questions about a debtor's intentions before any deadline had arrived was doing something different. He was protecting something, and the something he was protecting was not $460. "Thank you for telling me," Anselma said. Nola looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once: worry, solidarity, and something that might have been the particular kind of fear that comes from having done a small, brave thing and not knowing yet what it would cost. Anselma hired the Thaddeus boy from down the street to help carry the supplies to the base of the Stonecap Ridge Trail. She did not hire him to carry them up the trail. She carried those herself. 3 trips up and 3 trips down, and By the time she made the last climb, the light was already going orange in the southwest, and the widow's breath was finding its evening register lower in pitch, more settled into its purpose. The parcel of land her husband had inherited from his uncle, and which had now passed to her, occupied roughly 4 acres on the broad shoulder of the ridge, where the slope eased before rising again toward the true summit. It was not picturesque in any way that the word was usually intended. The ridge shoulder was exposed on 3 sides, open to weather from the north, the west, and the northeast, sheltered only by the continuing rise of the mountain to the south. The soil was thin everywhere and absent in places, the bare granite showing through in long gray shelves and isolated boulders that sat in the thin grass like the ruins of something much older than any human settlement. The grass itself was the wiry mountain variety that turned brown by September and stayed brown until May, useful for nothing and persistent as a grudge. Near the center of the parcel stood the remains of what had once been a shepherd's shelter, or perhaps a trapper's camp, or perhaps simply the optimistic attempt of some earlier person to establish a permanent presence in a place that had no interest in permanence. It had been a single-room structure, stone-walled in the dry stacking method common to the region, and it had collapsed at some point within the last decade or two. The walls tumbled inward so that what remained was a rough rectangle of fallen stone around a depression that had once been an earthen floor. The stones were the local granite, dense and dark gray, colonized by moss and lichen on their upper faces where moisture collected. Bramble had worked into the pile from the south corner bare cane, now in October, and a single twisted hawthorn had established itself against the north wall remnant, bent by decades of prevailing wind into a shape that was almost theatrical in its suffering. Anselma walked the perimeter of the collapsed structure, slowly placing her feet carefully among the fallen stones. The light was low and the shadows between the rocks were deep, and she was looking at the rocks rather than where she stepped, so she was moving with the deliberate care of someone reading a document written in stone. She stopped at the northeast corner. 2 of the original foundation stones still stood in place, a flat granite slab and a longer, irregular block that had once formed the corner of the wall. They were set deeper than the wall stones, anchored into the soil at a level where the frost usually penetrated, and they were still plumb and stable even though everything built on top of them had failed. Someone who knew what they were doing had set these stones. Someone who understood that the foundation's relationship with the earth beneath it was the only relationship that ultimately mattered. She crouched to look in the face of the larger foundation stone and found what she had half expected to find without knowing she expected it. Cut into the granite in careful, if not expert letters, were the initials MV, and below them the year 1879. 14 years ago, she traced the letters with one finger and felt the grain of the granite under her fingertip, the weight of the stone's age, and the strange intimacy of finding someone's mark in a place where no one else had thought to look. She did not know yet whose initials they were. She only knew they were there, which meant someone had been here before her, had set stones in the earth of this place, had stayed long enough to leave a mark, and had eventually gone away or been gone. She filed this away in the same place she filed other information that was incomplete but might become useful. The tent went up in the lee of the collapsed north wall. The widow's breath found it immediately, popping the canvas and straining the stakes. She drove them deeper and added stones to the base, and the tent became slightly less theatrical in its movements, though it did not become quiet. She ate cold beans from a can sitting on one of the fallen wall stones with her back to the wind. The lights of Ridgeton were coming on below each one, a small orange window. A fire someone's evening was arranged around. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was longing. She felt instead the particular clarity that arrives when a situation has been stripped of its options, and what remains is simply what needs to be done. In the tent, she lit one candle and opened the book to page 47 and read the chapter from the beginning, then read it again more slowly. She lay back on the bedroll and did not sleep immediately. She lay in the cold dark, listening to the tent fight the wind, and thought about patience, about what it meant to outlast rather than overcome, about the difference between a structure that resisted its environment and one that simply became part of it. The next morning, she began clearing the ruin. The work started before she had a plan for the work, which was the honest order of operations for this kind of project. She moved the smaller fallen stones, first carrying them by hand, to a clear area south of the ruin where she could assess them. The larger stones she left in place until she understood more about what she was dealing with. By mid-morning, she had cleared roughly the eastern third of the collapsed floor space and could see the original earthen floor of the structure, packed hard by years of use, and then protected from further weathering by the fallen stones on top of it. The floor was lower than the surrounding grade by about 2 feet, which she recognized as the original decision of whoever had built the shelter to set the floor below grade for warmth and stability. By the end of the fourth day, she had cleared the full footprint and excavated an additional 6 inches below the original floor level across the whole space. Her hands had changed during this period. The blisters she expected. What she did not expect was how quickly the underlying tissue adapted, how the skin that replaced the blistered skin was categorically different from what had been there before. Harder and less sensitive. She was becoming by increments a person physically suited to this work, which was not a transformation she had sought, but which was happening whether she sought it or not. On the fifth day, she found what changed everything. She had driven a chisel into the subsoil to test depth, expecting the frozen resistance of autumn earth. The top layer was exactly as hard as she'd expected. But below that, at roughly 18 inches, the soil became noticeably easier to penetrate. Not soft, not warm in any dramatic sense, but different in a way that was measurable. She drove the chisel again and held her bare hand near the hole. In the full cold of an October morning at 32 degrees, with the widow's breath running at its regular pace, the air coming up from that hole was not warm, but it was less cold. The difference was small enough that she might have dismissed it on any other day in any other circumstance. But she had been cold for 2 months. Cold in the profound way of a person who has stopped being able to take warmth for granted, and her body's ability to register small differentials in temperature had been calibrated by necessity to a very fine degree. She had been on her knees for 20 minutes before she understood what she was feeling. The moment of understanding was not cinematic. It was quiet and slightly disorienting, the way important realizations tend to be. Less like a door opening than like noticing that a door you thought was locked has been standing ajar for some time. Her grandmother Eleanor had been a woman who didn't waste words on things she couldn't demonstrate, but who believed completely in certain principles she had acquired through a life of close observation. Eleanor had grown up on the far side of the same ridge system in a hollow so narrow the sun only reached the floor of it for 4 months of the year. She knew things that other people treated as superstition, but which were in fact physics expressed in the language of experience. One of the things she had said to Anselma over the years, sitting by the iron stove in the winter kitchen with a cup of tea cooling in her hands, was this: the summer sun drives heat into the ground, the way rain drives into dry soil, slow and deep. By the time winter gets here, that heat is 10 feet down. The earth keeps a secret summer in its bones, child. The cold can't reach that deep before spring comes around to start the cycle again. Anselma had stored this away the way a child stores the things grandmothers say. In the category of old wisdom, probably true in some general sense, not immediately applicable. Now she was kneeling in a half-excavated ruin with her bare hand over a hole in the ground, and the mathematics of it were not metaphorical at all. The ground was not freezing down here the way the surface was freezing. The surface was cold because it was in direct contact with the air and the wind and the radiation of heat into the clear night sky. But the mass of the earth below a certain depth did not participate in the season the same way. It had its own thermal schedule, slower and deeper, and it was running on the accumulated warmth of the summer that had just passed. She sat back on her heels and looked at the rectangle of the ruin around her, looked at the mountains visible over the top of the surviving wall fragment to the north, looked at her own hands reddened and beginning to crack at the knuckles from the cold in the work, looked back at the ruin. Everyone in the valley below built up, built walls that went above grade and depended on their own mass and the fires inside them to hold back the cold. They spent the winter in an ongoing contest with the temperature, a contest that required continuous fuel, continuous maintenance, continuous effort. They saw the ground as the source of the cold, the enemy, the thing that leached heat out of their floors and froze their root cellars and made their foundations heave. What if the ground was not the enemy? The thought arrived whole and settled the way thoughts arrive when they are actually the conclusion of a long argument that has been running below the surface of conscious awareness. She was not going to build a house on this land. She was going to build a house in it. She was going to dig into the slope at the natural depression of the old foundation, enlarge the existing hollow, and let the mountain be her walls. Not fight the cold. Outlast it, the way Galen had underlined in soft pencil on page 47. The immediate corollary thought was that this was the plan of a person who had run out of reasonable options. That it was the kind of plan that people who had nothing left to lose arrived at by process of elimination, and that the townspeople of Ridgeton, when they found out, would have something definitive to say about her mental state. She sat with this for a moment and found that she did not particularly care. The conventional approach, building up, building walls, buying fuel, was not available to her. It required money she did not have and skills in timber framing she had never acquired. What she had was a pickaxe, a set of stone chisels, her own body in a ruin that had already done some of the excavation for her. Anselma Blackwell picked up the pickaxe. The frozen layer at the surface resisted the first strike with the particular stubbornness of material that is not naturally hard, but has been made hard by external conditions. She adjusted her grip, narrowed her focus, and struck the same spot again, and again, and again. Below the frost layer, the soil changed. It became possible. Not easy, not cooperative, but possible, which was a different category entirely. She worked until the light failed and ate and went to bed and woke up the next morning and worked again. This was the rhythm, and the rhythm did not need to be complicated because the work was clear. The tent was temporary. The ruin needed to become something else. These facts organized her time more efficiently than any schedule she might have imposed on herself. And so it began. The east wall fell on a Tuesday 3 weeks into November, and Anselma stood in the cold looking at the stones distributed across the floor of the excavation and understood something she had not understood before. She had been building the retaining walls the way she had been taught, implicitly and without instruction, that structures were built from the outside in, posing an idea of order onto material that had its own ideas. The stones were not cooperating with this approach. The third course of the east wall had listed inward for 2 days before she corrected it, and then the correction had transferred the instability to the course below, and now the whole east face was back on the ground, and she was standing in the ruins of 2 weeks of careful work. She did not curse. She did not sit down. She walked the perimeter of what she'd knocked apart and looked at each stone individually, the way she had not looked at them when she was fitting them together in the configuration she had planned. The long granite slab she'd been using as a third-course header was slightly bowed along its length. She had placed it bowed side down, which meant its weight was distributed at 2 points rather than across the full contact surface, which meant every stone above it was working against itself. She had been ignoring what the material was telling her because she had a plan that the material was supposed to follow. She turned the slab over, reset it, bowed side up so its weight pressed down against the convexity, and seated it into the courses below. Then she rebuilt the wall from that course, stone by stone, slower this time, each piece placed and tested for stability before the next one went on top. By late afternoon, the wall had reached a height she'd achieved twice before, and this time it did not move. She pressed against it with both hands, and it pressed back. She did not feel triumph. She felt the specific muted satisfaction of a problem that had been solved by understanding it rather than overcoming it, which was a different thing entirely and produced a different quality of result. The days shortened with the particular efficiency of November at elevation, light going by 4 in the afternoon. She developed a relationship with the dark hours that she had not had before, an accommodation with the limits of candlelight and the limits of what her body could sustain past a certain point in the evening. She ate, she read, she slept longer than she had in years. Not from laziness, but from expenditure, her body drawing down recovery with the same systematic thoroughness she was applying to the excavation. She woke before first light and worked until dark, and the days were simple in a way she would not have been able to value before this particular season of her life. On the morning of the 8th day of this new rhythm, she heard someone coming up the trail before she saw them. The sound of footsteps on the stone sections carried well in the cold air, and she had time to register that whoever it was not making any attempt to be quiet, which meant they were not Cornelius Kinnaird, who would have wanted the element of surprise. She set down the chisel she'd been working with and waited. The man who appeared at the edge of the ruin site was in his early 60s, thickly built in the way of men who have been doing physical work their entire lives. His face carried the specific texture of skin that has been outdoors in Appalachian weather for decades. The deep creasing around the eyes from squinting in wind and sun. The redness along the cheekbones that never fully faded. He was leading a mule with a pack frame carrying a canvas sack, and he stopped at the edge of the cleared area and looked from the excavated space to Anselma, to the growing pile of sorted stones with an expression that was processing a significant amount of information at once. His name was Roscoe Van de Veer, and she knew him by sight the way you knew the neighbors of neighbors in a county this size. By seeing him at the Ridgeton supply store and at the summer fair and at the edges of events, he was too self-contained to enter fully. She knew he ran a farm about a mile down the valley alone, since his wife Theta had died of a fever 3 winters past. She knew he had been a fixture on this particular stretch of mountain for long enough that he was himself a kind of landmark. She did not know him well enough to anticipate what he would say. His eyes moved across the site with the systematic attention of a man accustomed to assessing terrain and structures. They stopped at the excavated corner where she had cut deepest into the slope. He looked at that corner for a moment longer than he looked at anything else. "Woman," he said, and then stopped. Started again. "What in the name of sense are you doing? Building a house?" He looked at the hole, then at her, then at the mountains beyond the ridge. The wind came through the site in a sustained gust, and both of them leaned into it slightly and said nothing while it passed. My father used to say something about this land. He wasn't looking at her when he said it, still looking at the excavated corner. Said the dirt up here was different. I asked him different how, and he got that look he got when he knew something he didn't have the words for. Another pause. I always thought he meant it was bad different. He did not elaborate. He untied the canvas sack from the pack frame and set it on one of the cleared stones. Inside, she found a loaf of dark bread, a jar of pickled beans, a block of hard yellow cheese, and at the bottom of the sack, coiled like something that had been placed there with specific intention, a length of heavy rope, the kind used for draft work with more tensile strength than anything she could have found on the ridge. Before she could say anything about any of it, he had turned back to the trail. He paused at the top of it, not looking back. Stubborn ground for stubborn people. My father said that too. Then he was gone, his boots on the stone trail fading into the ordinary sounds of the mountain. Anselma looked at the rope. She looked at the direction where Roscoe Vanderveer had been at the empty trail. She did not know yet what his presence meant, or whether it would recur, or whether the sack of food was a one-time accounting for some obligation he felt toward the dead or the living. She only knew that the rope was exactly what she needed and that he had known this without being told. 6 days later, Cornelius Kinnaird came up the trail. She heard the difference immediately. Good boots on stone, unhurried. The pace of a man who was not accustomed to terrain, but was too proud to let terrain adjust his rhythm. He was not alone. Kinnaird wore the same kind of coat he wore in town. Good wool dark, the sort of coat that announced a certain income level and a certain detachment from outdoor work. He stopped at the rim of what had become a substantial excavation, the opening cut back into the slope by nearly 8 feet, now flanked on both sides by the beginning courses of the retaining wall she was laying in dry stone. Behind him, 3 paces back, stood Ansel Whitmore. Anselma knew Ansel by sight from town, a thin man with narrow-set eyes who worked for Kinnaird in capacities that were never precisely defined. He collected debts. He surveyed properties. He carried messages that Kinnaird preferred not to deliver in his own handwriting. He was the kind of man who performed tasks without needing to understand their larger purpose, and he was good at his work in the way that tools are good at their work, through function rather than judgment. Ansel did not speak during what followed. He walked the perimeter of the excavation while Kinnaird talked, looking at the wall construction, at the sorted stone pile, at the lever system she'd assembled from fallen pine. Anselma watched him the way she watched weather building on a distant ridge. He was mapping the site in his head, recording dimensions and configurations and structural details. And she understood that his presence was not incidental. Kinnaird had brought eyes with him, the kind of eyes that would remember what they saw and report it accurately. Last chance at a fair deal, Anselma. Kinnaird used her first name the way people use first names when they want to indicate that formality has not been earned. The offer stands, more than fair given what I'm seeing here. What are you seeing? Anselma asked. A woman working herself to ruin on a piece of ground that isn't worth the effort she's putting into it. She stood up from the wall course she'd been setting and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd arrived. Something in the quality of her attention made him stop talking. Mr. Kinnaird, second time I'll ask, what do you want this land for? He smiled. I want what Galen owed me. Land is land, Anselma, and the clock on that obligation is running. I know what the clock is doing. He looked around the site once more, and in that look she read something she had not seen in him before. Not at the courthouse, not at the reading of the debt. It was not the casual dismissiveness of a man indulging a widow's eccentricity. It was something more focused, more specifically directed at the land itself. He was looking at the ridge, at the slope, at the ground, not at her project, at the ground itself. He left without the agreement he had come for. She watched him pick his way back down the trail, his good coat moving through the brown November slope. Ansel followed 3 paces behind, and Anselma noticed that Ansel looked back once, not at her, but at the wall she had built, with the evaluating gaze of a man who was determining how easily something could be undone. And she noticed the direction of Kinnaird's last glance before the trail bent and took him out of sight. Not at her, up the ridge, toward the high ground above Stone Cap. 3 days after Kinnaird's visit, Anselma went down to the creek to fill her water containers. It was a 40-minute round trip on the trail she'd worn through the undergrowth, and she had been making it twice daily since she arrived on the ridge. When she returned, she knew immediately that someone had been at the site. 3 stones on the upper course of the west wall had been shifted. Not enough to collapse the wall, just enough to introduce instability into the section, a subtle displacement that would have looked like natural settling to someone who didn't know exactly where each stone had been placed. But Anselma knew where each stone had been placed. She knew their individual shapes the way a mother knows her children's faces. And these 3 had been moved by hands, not by gravity. Boot prints in the soft soil near the south corner, larger than hers, a different tread pattern. She stood looking at the displaced stones for a long time. She could feel the anger in her chest, a heat that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with violation. Someone had come to the place she was building and put their hands on it with the intention of making it fail. Not dramatically, not completely, just enough to discourage. Just enough to make the work feel futile, just enough that no one could prove it was deliberate. She did not fix the wall that day. She sat on the foundation stone and looked at the west section and thought about Ansel Whitmore's face as he'd walked the perimeter, the way his eyes had measured the construction, the way he'd looked back at the wall from the trail. He had been determining vulnerabilities, and he had returned to exploit the one he'd identified. What Anselma did next was the thing Ansel had not anticipated. She dismantled the entire west section down to the foundation course. Every stone. She examined each one with the attention she should have given them when she first built the section, and she found what she had been avoiding. The west wall had been her weakest work. She had built it early before the east wall taught her how stone wanted to sit, and she had been putting off the reckoning with its insufficiencies because rebuilding it meant losing days. Ansel had given her the reason to stop putting it off. She rebuilt the west wall from the second course up, and when she finished, it was the strongest section on the site. That night, she strung the rope from Roscoe across the trail, approach low to the ground, attached at one end to a tin of pebbles balanced on a rock ledge. If anyone crossed it, the tin would fall and the sound would carry. It was not a trap. It was a statement, and it was a system that allowed her to sleep. Nola Brashear came up the trail on a Thursday afternoon in late November, carrying a cloth sack of food. Anselma saw her coming from inside the excavation and climbed out to meet her, and she knew before Nola reached the site that something was wrong. Nola's posture was different. The openness that characterized her, the unguarded quality that Anselma valued in her precisely because it was so rare in Ridgeton, had been replaced by something held and careful. She was carrying more than the sack. They sat on the cleared stones at the south edge of the site, and Nola did not speak for several minutes. She looked at the excavation, at the walls, at the work that had transformed the collapsed ruin into something that was beginning to have architectural intention. She looked at it the way people looked at things they wanted to admire but were afraid to associate themselves with. "Kinnaird came to my house again," she said finally. Her voice had the flattened quality of someone reporting facts they were ashamed of knowing. "He didn't threaten me. He's too careful for that. He just reminded me that Cassius's house, the one I'm living in, has a small loan attached to it. Cassius's loan. And he said he hoped I wouldn't find myself in difficulty because of, and these were his words, relationships that weren't in my best interest. She was looking at her own hands when she said this. He wants me to stop helping you, and he wants me to tell him what you're building up here. The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. The weight of a small woman sitting on a cold stone on a November mountain being asked to choose between her own security and her friendship with another woman whose security was already gone. Tell him whatever you need to tell him, Anselma said. I'm not hiding anything up here. Nola's eyes filled, not because she was frightened, because she was ashamed that she had considered even for a moment doing what Kinnaird wanted. The consideration itself felt like a betrayal, and the shame of it was worse than any threat Kinnaird could have made. Anselma took her hand briefly firmly and then let it go. She did not tell Nola it was all right because it was not all right. What Kinnaird was doing was not all right. But she would not add to Nola's burden by asking her to carry anger on Anselma's behalf. After Nola left, picking her way down the trail in the failing afternoon light, Anselma sat alone in the excavation. The wind was running hard from the north, and the temperature was dropping toward what she estimated would be a hard freeze overnight. She should have been working. There were 2 more hours of useful light and stone to move and wall to build. Instead, she sat, and for the first time since she had come up the mountain, the doubt arrived. Not the practical doubt of whether the structure would work. She had evidence for that. The ground was measurably warmer at depth. The walls she had rebuilt were standing. The principles in the book were sound. That was not the doubt. The doubt was about herself, about whether she was doing something courageous or something insane, and whether there was a meaningful difference between the two when the outcome was uncertain. About whether Oglesby was right and she was a grieving woman making decisions that a stable mind would not have made. About whether she was dragging other people, Nola Roscoe, into the radius of her own destruction. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from something beneath cold. The specific tremor that arrives when a person who has been operating on certainty encounters the possibility that certainty was performance, not truth. She sat with it. She did not push it away. She did not argue with it or try to resolve it through force of will. She sat on the floor of the excavation with her back against the east retaining wall, and she let the doubt occupy the space it was claiming. And then she placed her palm flat against the earth at the deepest point of the floor. The ground pressed back, steady and constant and indifferent to her uncertainty. It did not care whether she doubted. It did not care whether Oglesby thought she was mad, or Kinnaird thought she was foolish, or Nola was being threatened on her account. It simply was what it was, warmer than the air, warmer than the surface, holding what it held, a fact that existed independent of anyone's opinion about it. She did not overcome the doubt. The doubt did not vanish in a moment of revelation or resolve. It simply became smaller than the evidence beneath her hand. And that was enough to stand up and pick up the chisel and get back to work. The roof was the problem she had not let herself think about until the walls were high enough to require one. She had no timber suitable for beams. The book described corbelling the use of flat stone slabs placed in overlapping sequence to span a gap. Each slab had to be large enough, thick enough, and flat enough to bridge the opening and bear the weight of whatever would be placed on top of it. She spent 2 days walking the ridge assessing granite outcroppings and identified 5 slabs she believed would work. None of them were near the site. The nearest was 60 feet away and downslope. The largest was on the exposed face of the ridge above a horizontal shelf that required careful undercutting before it would separate from the mass around it. The first slab took her a day and a half to move using the rope from Roscoe and the lever system she had refined over the previous weeks. Each cycle of the lever moved the stone perhaps an inch, the stone settling with a grating sound into its new position before she repositioned the fulcrum and applied the lever again. When it was finally in position across the east end of the wall opening, she stood on top of it and jumped once lightly. There was no give, no flex. The stone was indifferent to her weight. The second slab went into place without incident. The third was the one that nearly killed her. It was the large slab from the upper ridge. 2 days of undercutting with the chisel to free it from the surrounding shelf. She worked it carefully, leaving the far edge attached as a hinge point that would let it tip toward her rather than away. She rigged the rope attachment the way the book described a loop under the near edge and back over the top using the stone's own weight to keep the loop seated. She was 2/3 through the move, the slab having traveled roughly 40 feet from its original position when the rope shifted. She felt it in the line before she saw it. A change in the tension character. A slight wrongness in how the force was transmitting through the lever. She had a second, perhaps two. The slope below her was too steep to run on and the ground too rough, and there was no direction that offered escape in the time she had. She dropped straight down, pulled her legs to her chest, and the slab moved. It did not go where she had been standing. It went 3 feet to the left, following the fall line of the slope, and it took her left foot with it for approximately 18 inches before the geometry of her body stopped the contact. The pressure was immense and brief and wrong in a way that registered less as pain initially than as information. A sudden and extremely specific data point about the limits of what bone and granite could negotiate. She lay on the slope for some time. The slab had come to rest against a boulder 10 feet below, sitting there with the permanence of things that have found their level. The sky above was the close gray of late November, the clouds moving quickly. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and ran an inventory of her body starting from the foot and working upward. 2 toes on the left foot she assessed by the particular quality of the pain and the swelling she could feel beginning inside the boot. Not the ankle, not the shin. 2 toes, which was a problem she could manage, which was not the same as a problem that was not serious, but which fell on the survivable side of a line she had been aware of crossing toward for the last several weeks. She tore the lower section of her shirt into strips and bound the toes together against the uninjured ones for stability, working by feel inside the boot, not removing it because she would not be able to get it back on. Then she sat up. Then she stood. The left foot bore weight the way broken things bear weight when they have no other option, complaining at the cellular level while the rest of the organism overrules them. 2 days later, Reverend Matthias Oglesby climbed the trail. He was not alone. He had brought Gideon Hollowell with him, a well-respected farmer from the Middle Valley, whose opinion carried weight in Ridgeton's informal hierarchy of credibility. Hollowell was a practical man who had built 3 barns and 2 houses in his lifetime, and whose judgment about structures and the people who built them was considered reliable. Oglesby had recruited him as a witness, a second voice that would give authority to what Oglesby intended to say. Anselma was standing on the injured foot when they arrived, sweat on her forehead from the pain she was managing and the stone she had just placed. She did not sit down when she saw them. She understood immediately what this was. Oglesby had organized an intervention. Anselma. Oglesby's voice had the tone she had heard him use with the elderly and the confused, gentle and firm, and absolutely certain of its own correctness. We can see you're injured. You're alone on this mountain in winter. This is not the behavior of someone in a stable frame of mind. I'm saying this as your pastor and your neighbor. Come down, accept Kinnaird's offer, start over somewhere else. Hollowell stood slightly behind Oglesby, and Anselma could read the discomfort in his posture. He had come because Oglesby asked him, and because Oglesby's argument sounded reasonable in a warm room in town. It was sounding different up here in the presence of what she had actually built. She looked at Hollowell, not at Oglesby. Mr. Hollowell, do you see this wall? Hollowell looked. The east retaining wall, the one she had rebuilt 3 times, stood 5 courses high and ran the full length of the excavation. The stones were fitted without mortar, each one seated against its neighbors, with a precision that was not artistic, but was undeniably competent. I built it 3 times, she said. First 2 times it fell because I was forcing the stone into positions I wanted instead of positions they wanted. Third time I listened to what the material was telling me. That wall is standing because every stone in it is where it wants to be. She turned to Oglesby. I'm not out of my mind, Reverend. I'm injured because I'm building a house, not because I'm losing mine. Hollowell looked at the wall. He looked at the excavation at the depth of the cut into the slope, at the granite roof slab already in position at the east end. He looked at these things with the eye of a man who had built structures and who recognized competence when it was standing in front of him. He turned to Oglesby. Josiah, that wall is straighter than my barn. The words landed in the cold air between the 3 of them. Oglesby's face did a complicated thing, the kind of recalculation that happens when a man who came to rescue someone discovers that the person does not need rescuing and that the ally he brought has defected. Oglesby left first, picking his way down the trail with the rigid posture of a man whose authority had been declined in front of a witness. Hollowell lingered. He walked to the edge of the excavation and looked down into it. He stood there for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, meant for her and not for the departing Oglesby. Is it warm inside? Yes. Hollowell nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away. Then he followed Oglesby down the trail, and Anselma knew with certainty that the question he had just asked would travel back to Ridgeton with him and would be repeated, and that the repetition would do more for her than any argument she could have made. Roscoe Vanderveer came up the trail for the second time 2 days later. He had brought a heavier sack. Potatoes, a cured pork hock wrapped in cloth, a jar of apple butter, and a small tin of ground coffee that she had not permitted herself to spend money on in Ridgeton. He sat on the foundation stone and looked at the work for a while without saying anything. The east wall, the positioned roof, slabs the depth of the excavation. He took it in the way he took in everything, methodically and completely, and when he spoke, his voice had a different quality than the voice he'd used at his first visit. Less armored, closer to whatever it was that lived under the armor. Theta used to look at things the way you look at things. He was looking at the positioned roof slabs when he said it. She'd look at a problem, and the rest of us would be trying to argue the problem out of existence, and she'd already be 3 steps past it, working on the solution. I didn't understand it when she was alive. Thought she was just impatient. A long pause. The wind moved through the site, and neither of them acknowledged it. I was wrong about what I was watching. He left before she could respond to this, which was perhaps intentional. And as he descended the trail, she noticed he had left behind a second coil of rope thicker than the first, the kind rated for draft animals. She stood holding it and thought about what he had said. It was not a complicated thing. It was an old man finding a way to say that he had been wrong about something once and had been paying attention since. But it was the first time since Galen died that someone had described her in terms that were not about her grief or her situation, and she found it sat differently than she expected. Not warmly exactly, but with a kind of ballast. The weight of being seen accurately by someone who had no obligation to see her at all. The remaining slabs went into position over the following 2 weeks. She moved each one with the adjusted rigging she'd designed after the accident, 2 lines instead of one, the attachment geometry revised so that no single failure point could release the load. Her foot rearranged the work around itself the way water rearranges around a stone in a stream, arriving at the same place by a slightly different route. She limped and stopped frequently, and the work took longer, and none of this changed what needed to happen. The sealing of the gaps between the roof slabs took a week. Smaller stones and clay packed into each crack and tested for air movement by holding a candle flame near the surface and watching for deflection. When no gap showed movement, she began laying the soil on top, building it up in packed courses from the excavation spoil. The weight of the soil pressed the slabs down against the walls and the walls deeper into the ground, and the whole assembly became, through compression, something more stable than any of its components had been individually. She laid the turf last cut from the ridge grass 50 feet away, pressed against the soil layer, and tamped. From the trail below, what she saw was a slight irregularity in the hillside. A low mound with a stone-faced entrance that caught the eye only because of the wall stone's arrangement. 15 feet to either side of it, the slope looked as it had always looked. The interior was 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep, walled on the sides and back by packed earth. The floor was the deep subsoil she had excavated, tamped and leveled, and covered with a layer of clean sand she had carried up from the creek bed. The entrance was framed by stone walls low enough to require ducking and closed by a door she had built from the pine boards of the supply crates fitted together with wooden pegs and hung on iron hinges she had purchased on her last trip to Ridgeon. She lit the stove the evening the door was hung. A rusted metal drum she had found half buried in the gorge below the site, its seams hammered tight. A pipe run through a packed clay chimney she had built into the south wall junction with the roof. She sat on the floor and watched the temperature change. The stove was small and its fire was small, but the space was small too, and sealed and sitting inside the mass of the mountain. The stove needed to do very little. The candle she lit burned with a flame so steady it seemed painted. No draft, no movement. She sat on the floor for an hour doing nothing, which was not something she had done once in the previous 2 months. She sat and breathed and felt the temperature settle into something her body recognized without drama or gratitude as simply adequate, warm enough. That evening, she went through Galen's papers again. The full collection she had kept in the flat tin box at the bottom of her trunk. She found what she had looked at before and dismissed as a clerical notation. A half sheet of paper in Galen's handwriting, a row of figures and initials, and the notation partial satisfaction of obligation, and beside it the initials OP. She had assumed this was something from the Harmon Creek investment, one of Galen's many transactions with various parties. Now she set it under the candle and read it again. The figures matched at almost exactly half the total outstanding to Kinnaird. The date was 6 weeks before Galen died. Josias Dillingham had the initials WL, but Ogden Pemberton Kinnaird's former business partner, who had left the county in 1891, had the initials OP. Dillingham had given no indication at the courthouse reading that any payment had been made. He had read the full debt as outstanding. Either Dillingham didn't know about this payment, which seemed unlikely, or he did know and had not mentioned it. And Josias Dillingham was not a man who made errors in legal proceedings. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, separate from the rest. The next morning she stepped outside and stopped. The sky to the northwest had changed overnight. The clouds had the specific texture she associated with serious weather. Not the soft gray of ordinary winter cloud, but a denser, lower mass with a quality to the light beneath it that seemed to absorb rather than reflect. She had not seen a sky like this in several years. Not since the winter of 1888, when she'd been 16, and the storm that came through in March had kept the hollow where her family's farm sat buried for 11 days. She went down the mountain at a careful pace on the injured foot and bought twice what she had planned at Lavinia Ashworth's store. Lavinia watched the list grow without commentary, but when Anselma was loading the pack, Lavinia disappeared into the back and came out with a small battery-powered radio military surplus from some catalog. "Keep it. My brother sent it from Pittsburgh and I have no use for it. The signal from Charleston gets through on clear nights. They've been running weather forecasts." Anselma climbed the mountain in the last of the light. By the time she crested the ridge, the northwestern sky had gone the color of old pewter. All the way to the zenith, and the wind which had been its usual sustained presence had stopped. The silence was absolute. The pines below the ridge had gone quiet. Their branches arrested the whole mountain, holding still with the particular held breath quality of something that was about to change completely. She went inside, she barred the door, she lit the stove and sat on the floor and turned on the radio and waited for Charleston. The forecast came through at 9 o'clock. The announcer's voice was uneven with static, but the words were clear enough. Historic storm system. Potentially the largest single snowfall event since records began in the region. Sustained winds above 40 miles per hour. Snowfall estimates ranging from 6 to 12 feet on the higher elevations. Duration 72 to 96 hours. She turned the radio off and sat with the information. The stove was small and the room was warm, and the candle on the shelf did not move. Outside, the silence was so complete, it had become its own kind of sound. The sound of a force gathering itself below the threshold of hearing building in the dark above the ridge line where the clouds had been eating the stars for the past 2 hours. She thought about Roscoe Vandever in his farmhouse a mile down the valley, wood-framed, 3 generations old, northwest facing. She had been inside it once years ago when Theta was alive. Good walls, good timber, low roof pitch. But it faced directly into the primary wind direction, and the window frames were the originals, and she knew from that one visit that the interior shrank. When the wind ran hard, contracting itself around the fire, the warmth always smaller than the room. She thought about the beam that held that roof, how old it was, how long it had been carrying weight. She banked the stove carefully and lay down and pulled the blankets over and listened to the mountain hold its breath around her. And somewhere in the dark on the other side of the ridge, the first flakes began to fall. The storm did not arrive so much as the world outside ceased to be the world she recognized. By midnight, the wind had re-engaged at full force in a single moment, and the sound it made against the turf roof and the ridge above was not the sustained moan of ordinary winter nights, but something lower and more fundamental. A vibration that traveled through the packed earth beneath her before it reached the air inside the room. The roof did not move. The walls did not shift. The candle on the stone shelf described a flame so steady that it seemed to exist in a separate physics from the detonation happening 30 inches above it on the other side of the turf and stone. Anselma did not sleep that night, not from fear but from attention. She lay and listened to the storm the way she had learned to listen to things that were larger than herself, without trying to resolve them, without measuring them against outcomes. The sound changed register every few hours, dropping into a roar and then climbing to a pitch that meant the wind had reached its maximum velocity. And the earth around her absorbed each register equally, holding its temperature, conducting nothing inward except the faint vibration she felt in the floor when the gusts hit the ridge directly above. She thought about Roscoe Vandever. She thought about the beam she had seen in his ceiling the one time she had been inside. Old growth timber, massive, darkened with decades of wood smoke. It had held for 60 years. What she could not calculate, lying in the dark listening to the mountain absorb what the sky was delivering, was whether 60 years of holding had left the beam with reserves or with fatigue. The first day passed in a narrow circuit between the earthen room and the small flat area inside the entrance where she could stand upright. She ate. She read the early chapters of the Frontier Construction book, the ones about site selection and drainage that she had neglected when she was focused on the building chapters. She slept in the afternoon genuinely and deeply, the sleep of a body carrying no thermoregulation burden. When she woke, the sound outside was the same, and the room was the same temperature, and the candle was a quarter shorter. In the valley below, though, she could not see it and would not know the details until later the storm was conducting a different kind of arithmetic. The Harmon family in the Lowest Creek Hollow lost their roof in the first 6 hours. The accumulated snow load, combining with wind-driven uplift, to take the entire structure off its walls in a single catastrophic event. They made it to their barn and spent the first night with the animals, which was warmer than the house had become in the last hours before the roof went. The Hollowell family on the south-facing slope kept their fire burning through the first day, but ran through a third of their wood, doing it the wind finding the northern exposure of their house with a persistence that turned a good fire into a minimum condition rather than a comfort. Lavinia Ashworth's store stone built on the ground floor held without difficulty, and Lavinia had organized the 4 families who had come to her before the storm into a collective arrangement of food and heat that was neither comfortable nor desperate. Cornelius Kinnaird, in his larger building on the main street, had 2 fireplaces and a wood supply he had paid 3 men to stack in October. By the end of the first day, both fires were burning at capacity, and the building was maintaining a temperature that was adequate without being warm. The wood was diminishing at a rate he was tracking with close attention. He was a man accustomed to purchasing solutions. The storm operated entirely outside the economy he understood, and this was producing in him a discomfort that had no familiar resolution. Reverend Matthias Oglesby opened the church's shelter. 3 families came. It was the right thing to do, and he did it without hesitation. But by the second morning, the wood supply he had stored in the vestry was gone, and he made a decision that would stay with him. He broke apart the pews, the oak benches that the congregation had built when the church was raised 15 years earlier. He fed them to the stove one at a time and watched the grain of the wood darken and curl and turn to heat, and he sat among the families he was sheltering and thought about Anselma Blackwell on the mountain above, not with the certainty he had carried up her trail a week earlier, with something else, something that felt like the oak splintering under his hands, a structure he had trusted coming apart. The second night was when Roscoe Van de Veer's main roof beam failed. The crack woke him from a shallow sleep, a sound like a rifle shot from directly above. He lay still for a moment, cataloging it, and then sat up and looked at the ceiling and saw the fracture running the full length of the timber. The beam was 2 feet in diameter at the center. It had held for 60 years against every storm the ridge had produced. The snow on the roof above had exceeded by some margin everything those 60 years had prepared it for. He did not panic. Panic was not available to him as a response, not because he was without fear, but because fear in his generation and geography was something that converted directly into action without the intermediate stage of deliberation. He dressed in everything he owned that was wearable, which took 20 minutes, because his fingers were already impaired by the cold that had been working through the northwest wall for 2 days. He took the photograph of Theta from the mantel and put it inside his shirt against his chest. The photograph was the only possession he was certain he wanted to keep. He took the heavy walking stick he'd cut from an ash tree the previous spring. He opened the door. What met him was a physical medium, a substance with pressure and direction and force that imposed itself on his body the way current imposes itself on a man wading a flooded river. The snow was thigh-deep in the yard, hip-deep, where it had drifted against the fence line, and it was not powder, but a dense, consolidated mass that resisted movement with the stubbornness of wet sand. The wind hit the side of his face with a cold so focused it registered as targeted, as if the storm knew where he was exposed and was concentrating its attention there. He aimed himself northeast, uphill, towards Stonecap Ridge, because it was the only direction that contained anything he believed might still be standing. He fell at the fence line. He fell again 20 yards past it into a drift that came up to his chest and required him to swim rather than walk his way free. He lost the trail almost immediately, not because he did not know the land, but because the land had been replaced by a continuous white field in which no feature was visible beyond 3 feet in any direction. He navigated by slope, keeping the angle of ascent consistent, moving on the knowledge of the terrain that 40 years of working it had made into something below conscious recall. A physical memory in his legs and feet of how this particular ground tilted and where it changed character. The cold stopped being painful after the first 10 minutes. This was the information that frightened him more than the cold itself, because he knew what the absence of pain at low temperature meant, had known it since he was a young man, and his father had told him with the directness of someone transmitting survival information. He stopped and beat his hands against his thighs until sensation returned, a burning that was genuinely painful and therefore genuinely reassuring, and then moved on. He fell 7 more times before he reached the upper slope. The last 2 falls he did not immediately get up from, not from inability, but from the accumulation of effort. Each rise from the snow requiring a renegotiation with his body that took longer than the previous one. He lay face down in the snow the second to last time, and the thought that arrived was Theta. Her name, not a sentence, not a request, just her name, which was also a direction, and he was not certain whether it was a direction toward or away from where he was going. He decided it was away. He got up and moved. The wall of Anselma's entrance stopped him mid-fall. His foot caught the base of the east retaining wall, where the wind had scoured the snow clear against the stone, and he went forward, and his hands hit the wall face, and he hung there for a moment, his cheek against the granite. The stone was not cold the way the air was cold. It had a different quality, a moderated temperature that registered against his face as almost warm. The thermal mass of the structure behind it conducting its stored heat outward even into the face of the wall. He found the door by feel. He knocked with a fist that had very little sensation left in it, 3 times, which was all he managed before the effort of standing upright consumed everything available. Inside, Anselma had been awake for 2 hours. She heard the knock the first time without certainty. She heard it again, and it was not ambiguous. A specific irregular percussion against the plank door that had a human quality unmistakable from anything the wind produced. She had the door open in 3 seconds. What she saw was a man-shaped accumulation of snow and ice in the posture of someone who had been upright too recently to have fallen, but was not going to be upright much longer. She had one arm around him before she processed who he was, the instinct for response preceding identification. She walked him backward into the entrance, ducked him under the low frame, and got the door shut behind them. She could not save his fingers if she did not work fast. His coat buttons defeated her for precious seconds before she abandoned them, and pulled the coat over his head. She peeled the layers, replacing each one with dry blanket wrapping from the feet upward, the way you wrap a person who needs heat from outside while their own furnace catches up. She put water on the stove. She said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and she was not a person who filled silence with noise. Roscoe sat against the south wall, wrapped in everything she had. The shaking that took him was the productive kind, the body's furnace restarting. It went through 3 phases over 30 minutes. Violent, then irregular, then a continuous fine tremor that meant the core temperature was recovering. She put the heated mug into his hands when the gross shaking subsided, closing his fingers around it because he could not quite close them independently. He looked around the room. She watched him look. He was seeing it for the first time from the inside, and she could read the reassessment happening in his face. Not a dramatic shift, a slow settling. The air that was warm without being the warmth of a fire-dependent space. The walls of packed earth, holding their temperature the way they had been holding it since she sealed the roof. The stillness that was not the stillness of cold, but of equilibrium. "My roof beam," he said finally. His voice had the rough quality of a man who had been breathing ice air at maximum exertion. Cracked through the whole center span. She nodded. "If I'd stayed." He did not finish this because it did not require finishing. She refilled the mug. He held it in both hands, and the color came back into his fingers in increments. The white of extreme cold retreating from the tips and working toward the knuckles in a gradient she tracked because she needed to know if any of the tissue had gone past recovery. It had not. He was going to be entirely all right, which was not a guarantee she had been able to make when she opened the door. His eyes found the initials carved into the foundation stone she had mounted as part of the interior wall, visible now in the candlelight. MV 1879. The letters that had been facing outward before she repositioned the stone now facing inward, part of the interior of the room. "Mehitable Vandever," he said, and she heard in his voice something she had not expected. Not recognition alone, but recognition combined with reckoning. A man encountering a debt he did not know he owed. "My great-grandmother, she built something up here the winter of '79. I never knew what exactly. She lived through it. My grandfather said she tried to explain it to people afterward, and nobody listened. Said the ground was the answer, not the problem." He ran a thumb across the carved letters. Nobody knew what she meant. She never tried to explain it again. The silence that followed had weight and direction. It connected things across 14 years and across the gap between a woman who had known something and a woman who had found the same thing by different means. Across the distance between knowledge that dies with its holder and knowledge that the ground itself preserves, waiting for whoever is desperate or attentive enough to find it. "She built right," Anselma said, meaning the foundation stones, the ones that were still plumb and level when everything else had failed. Roscoe slept eventually sitting against the south wall with the blankets around him. Anselma sat on the opposite side and tended the stove through the night in small increments. The storm ran its full course outside, neither of them tracking it, both of them inside the mountain's patience waiting for it to finish. The third morning arrived without drama. The sound outside changed, losing its edge, becoming lower and more sustained. By midday, the snow had stopped. By late afternoon, a pale light was making its way through the aftermath. Anselma opened the door at 4 o'clock and looked at the ridge. The world had been remade. The snow had buried every reference point, every rock she knew, every path. The exposed granite faces on the upper ridge were scoured clean by wind, and the accumulated snow below them was sculpted into formations that bore no relation to the terrain underneath. Her structure was under 3 feet of additional snow on the roof. She pressed upward against the interior face of the roof slabs using her full shoulder and felt nothing move. The temperature inside had not dropped. The snow was not a threat. It was insulation, adding to the margin between the inside and the outside, thickening the distance between survival and its opposite. They went down the mountain together the next morning, Roscoe and Anselma, taking 2 hours to descend what was normally a 20-minute trail. The snow was consolidated enough to support weight in most places and treacherous in others, where hidden air pockets collapsed underfoot without warning. Ridgeton was altered in ways that would not be fully cataloged for weeks. The Harmon house was a foundation with timbers scattered across its lot. 3 other structures had lost significant roof sections. The street was impassable. The couple named Baxter, both in their 70s, had been found by their son when he dug his way to their house on the 3rd morning. They had gone to sleep in their chairs by the fire, which had gone out, and had not woken up. This fact traveled through the town in the way facts travel that reorganize how a community understands its own vulnerability, quietly and permanently. Roscoe told what had happened. He told it in the Ridgeton hardware store, which was where people had gathered because it was the largest heated space accessible. He told it with the directness of a man reporting conditions. He had gone up the mountain in the storm because his roof failed and it was the only option that had a chance of working. He had found a structure that was warmer inside than the valley houses were with their fires burning, and he was standing there in front of them because of it. He told it without elaboration and without the kind of framing that asked for a particular response. And the response it produced was more powerful for the absence of that framing. A silence in the room that had a different quality than ordinary silence. Reverend Oglesby stood in the crowd. He had spent 3 days burning church pews to keep 3 families alive. His hands still smelled of oak smoke. He heard Roscoe's account, and his face underwent something more complicated than embarrassment. It was the recognition that he had tried to prevent the very thing that had saved a man's life. He did not speak. His silence was the beginning of something. Nola Brescher was there. She heard Roscoe's words, and tears ran down her face without concealment. She found Anselma afterward and said 3 words, "I'm sorry." Anselma looked at her. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself one, and you've already paid it." Nola held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. Something in her posture changed, a straightening that had nothing to do with her spine and everything to do with what lived behind it. Lavinia Ashworth organized the procession up the mountain the following day. She did it the way she did everything without making it a demonstration. Simply a practical matter, a group of people who needed to see something going to see it. Roscoe led them up the trail, the path now broken by the descent he and Anselma had made the previous day. There were 11 people in the group. Josias Dillingham was among them. Cornelius Kinnaird was among them, which was a choice he had made for reasons that were probably complex and which he would not have been able to articulate clearly if asked. Reasons that had to do with the fact that a man who trades in land and its value cannot afford to be the last to understand what a particular piece of land has demonstrated about its own nature. Matthias Oglesby walked at the back of the group. He had not been invited and had not asked to come. He had simply appeared at the trailhead and fallen in at the rear, and no one had told him he could not. They stood at the entrance to the earthen structure and looked at it. The stone walls of the entrance, the low doorway, the mound of the roof with its snow load distributed evenly across the turf, the complete absence of drama in its appearance, the way it looked like something the mountain had always had rather than something imposed upon it. Lavinia was the first to speak. "I sold you the shovel. I thought you were digging a grave." Her voice carried the particular quality of a person saying something that cost them, an honest admission. I should have asked what you were building. You gave me the book, Anselma said. That was enough. The group moved through in pairs, ducking through the low entrance, standing in the interior, reaching out to touch the earthen walls, pressing their palms against the packed soil. Anselma watched them understand it one by one, the understanding moving across each face in the same sequence. Disbelief, then calculation, then the particular expression of a person who has just revised a fundamental assumption about how the world works. Matthias Oglesby came through near the end. He stood in the room longer than the others. He placed both palms flat against the wall and held them there, and something moved across his face that Anselma had never seen on it before. The dismantling of certainty. Not the certainty about her, the certainty about himself, about what he thought he understood about strength and fragility, and who needed saving and who did the saving. When he came out, he stood in front of her and spoke in a voice she had not heard from him. Not the pastoral voice, not the counseling voice, a voice that had been stripped of profession and reduced to person. I was wrong, not wrong about you, wrong about what I thought you needed. It was the shortest sentence she had ever heard him speak. It was also the most honest. Cornelius Kinnaird came through last, alone. He stood in the room for longer than any of them. When he emerged, everyone else had moved off and was talking in the low voices of people processing a shared experience. He looked at the entrance, at the stone walls, at the slope above. He looked at Anselma. I knew the thermal gradient on this ridge was unusual. His voice was the quietest she had heard it, stripped of its usual calibration. There's a geothermal formation under the upper slope. I had an engineer look at it in the spring. He said the ground temperature above it was measurably higher than the surrounding terrain. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the slope. I thought it had commercial value, some kind of extraction or development. I borrowed against it when I lent Galen the money. I needed his land because it sits above the formation. She let this settle without response for a moment. The pieces she had been holding separately, the debt, the land Kinnair's interest in the ground, rather than the house, his glances up the ridge, all of them arranged themselves into a single coherent shape. And Ogden Pemberton, his jaw moved, a small involuntary contraction. Pemberton found out what I was doing and paid half Galen's debt to compromise my claim. He and I had a disagreement about a previous venture. He was settling it. So you've been collecting on a debt that was partially discharged, without telling me. He did not answer this directly. He did not need to. Both of them understood what the silence contained. The remaining balance, given the circumstances of the misrepresentation, is forgiven. He took a folded paper from his coat and held it out. Dillingham drew up the discharge this morning. He did not use the word fraud. The word sat between them anyway, visible in its absence. Anselma took the paper. She did not thank him. He had not done a kind thing. He had done the only available thing with the least damaging outcome for himself. She recognized the difference and let the recognition show in the plainness of her expression. He left. She watched him go down the trail in his good wool coat, watched the coat become small against the white slope, and then disappear around the first bend. She held the paper and felt the negligible physical weight of a page that closed a chapter that had been open since Galen signed his name in March. Josias Dillingham came to stand beside her. He had the letter from Lewisburg in his briefcase. Pemberton's confirmation. The formal complaint ready to file with the circuit court. None of it necessary now. He told you about the geothermal formation, Dillingham said. He did. He's right that it's there. The engineer's report is filed with the county surveyor. You've been living directly above it. That's part of why your ground temperature is what it is. Does it have commercial value, she asked. Dillingham considered this with the careful pause of a man thinking about the difference between value that is extracted and value that is inhabited. "I'm not interested in extraction," she said. Spring came to the Appalachian Ridge the way it always came, reluctantly and in increments. The snowpack giving up its depth by degrees over 6 weeks, the ground emerging in patches that grew and merged, and finally claimed the slope entirely in a wet, deeply green grass that was the mountain's own version of beginning again. The hawthorn at the remnant of the original north wall put out leaves in April and bloomed in May. White flowers on its wind-bent branches, beautiful in the way of things that have survived difficulty without being simplified by it. 3 families came to Anselma in the first week after the snow cleared enough to make the trail reliably passable. Eli Barrow was among them, James Collier, whose house had lost its roof and whose family had spent the storm in Lavinia Ashworth's store, and Samuel Reed, a younger man who had moved his family to the county the previous year and had been boarding in Ridgeton because he had not yet established land of his own. They came without a spokesperson, simply 3 men who had been separately thinking about the same thing and had arrived independently at the same question. Anselma took them up the slope above her structure and crouched down and dug into the spring soil with her hands. She held up a handful and felt its composition, the clay and mineral and loam, and she explained what she had understood. She explained it once, starting not with the construction, but with the principle, because the principle was what made the construction possible, and without it, the construction was only copying without comprehension. She watched Eli Barrow's face when it registered. He was a practical man who understood the world through its operations, and she could see the principle arriving in his comprehension not as an idea but as a mechanism, something that could be applied in specific and repeatable ways. That was the moment she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The moment when the knowledge became someone else's knowledge and therefore became something larger than what she had found on her own. She worked alongside of them through the summer, more than she supervised them, because there were decisions that could only be made by the person who understood the specific ground in question. The drainage, the soil composition, the slope angle. She could not make those decisions for someone else's site any more than she could feel the thermal differential in their ground for them. But she could show them what to look for. She could correct the errors she recognized from having made them herself. She could hand a stone to a man and say, "This one, this face down, this corner there." And she had the credibility that comes from hands that have built the thing being described. Matthias Oglesby appeared at the second construction site on a morning in July. He did not bring words. He brought a shovel. He did not explain why he was there. He dug, and the digging was the longest and most honest apology he knew how to make. Not with language which had always been his instrument and his refuge, but with earth under his fingernails and sweat on his collar, and the silent admission that the thing he had tried to prevent was the thing most worth helping. Roscoe Van de Veer rebuilt his farmhouse that summer with a crew from Ridgeton. The foundation went deeper, 4 feet into the earth rather than the 18 inches that had been standard. The crawl space beneath the floor was enclosed and insulated with packed earth. The north wall was doubled in thickness, the gap between the 2 faces filled with rubble and clay. It was not an earth-sheltered structure. It was a house that had been educated by proximity to one. When winter came, his wood consumption dropped by 1/3. By September, there were 3 new earth-sheltered structures on the slopes adjacent to Stonecap Ridge, each one different from Anselma's in specific ways that reflected the specific ground and the specific needs of the family that had built it. None of them copies, all of them built on the same principle. They went into their first winter with a collective understanding of what was coming that none of them had had the previous year. An understanding that was no longer theoretical. Cornelius Kinnaird left Ridgeton the following spring. The formal complaint Dillingham had filed, even with the debt discharged, had followed him through the county's social and professional geography with the persistence of documented fact. He went south toward a county where his conduct had not yet preceded him. Nola Brashear went to Dillingham that same spring and asked him to review her late husband's loan papers with Kinnaird. Dillingham found terms that were, if not fraudulent, then constructed to extract maximum advantage from a young widow's ignorance of financial language. The actual balance owing was a fraction of what Kinnaird had implied. Nola paid it and was free. She did not become a hero. She became a woman standing on ground that belonged to her, which was a quieter thing and in many ways harder to achieve. Stonecap Ridge persisted in the county record. In the ordinary speech of the people who lived on it and near it and knew its specific character, it became Blackwell Ridge. By the second year, the way names become names through use without announcement. William Carey, an engineer from Charleston who had read the brief account Lavinia published in the Ridgeton Gazette that spring, came up the mountain in July with measuring instruments and a notebook he filled over 2 days. He was a precise and quiet man who asked questions the way Anselma asked questions, directly and without decoration, and she answered them in the same way. When he left, he told her he intended to write about the structure for a civil engineering journal published out of Pittsburgh. She told him to write about the principle, not the person. He said both were necessary, and she let this stand because she understood that he was right and that her preference for anonymity, while genuine, was not the same as a good reason. The article appeared the following spring. Lavinia brought a copy up the trail in April, climbing the slope with the periodical tucked under her arm and a look on her face that combined pride with a complexity of other things less easily named. The article was 5 pages long and called the structure a notable example of passive geothermal residential architecture. Anselma found the phrase somewhat large for what it described. But the principle was stated correctly, and the diagrams were accurate, and her name appeared in the 3rd paragraph as the designer and builder. And below her name in parentheses, as if Carey had understood that this was the part that mattered most, were the words self-taught, working from first principles. The 4th winter was the winter she finally slept without waking at 3 a.m. to tend the stove. She understood in her body rather than her mind that the room would be the same temperature whether she tended it or not, that the mountain was doing what the mountain had always been doing without her intervention, without her anxiety, without needing her to manage it. She woke in the mornings to a room that was exactly what it had been when she closed her eyes, a condition so reliable it had finally become unremarkable, which was the highest compliment she knew how to pay a thing she had built. She found Galen's message on a night in February of that 4th winter. She was reading the chapter on page 47 again, by habit rather than need. The pages had acquired the soft, slightly translucent quality of often handled paper. She was reading the facing page, a section on load distribution in stone vaulting, when her eye caught the small handwriting in the margin of 47. Cramped, faint, done in a pencil that had been sharpened to a fine point. She had not seen it before because she had always been reading the print, not the margins, and because in the tent in October she had been reading by failing candlelight that did not illuminate the page edges. 8 words in Galen's hand. In case I don't get to show you this myself. She read it twice. She sat with it in the quiet of the earthen room, the mountain pressing close on all sides with its old unhurried warmth. She thought about Galen reading this chapter in the spring, in whatever light he had been reading by. with whatever mix of hope and premonition had accompanied his life in those months before August. She thought about his pencil making those 8 words in the margin with the fine point he always kept, because he said thick pencil lines were imprecise. She thought about him leaving the book at Lavinia's store, not forgetting it, placing it there, where she would eventually come to look for something. She put her hand flat on the page over his handwriting, not pressing, just resting there, her palm against the paper that his pencil had touched, and she felt the warmth of the room around her, the warmth of the ground that surrounded the room, the warmth that the summer had put into the earth and the earth had kept against all the cold the season could produce, patient and inexhaustible, and available to anyone willing to go deep enough to find it. She did not conquer the mountain. She did not solve the mountain. She listened to it for long enough that it had nothing left to withhold. And what it gave her in return for that attention was not warmth exactly. The warmth was part of it. What it gave her was the understanding that the most durable things are not the ones that resist the forces around them, but the ones that have learned through depth and mass and time to simply outlast them. The candle burned, the earth held. The night passed into morning the way all nights did eventually, without her assistance, without her anxiety, without requiring anything from her at all, except the willingness to remain.